Value-added tax became reality in Nigeria through the VAT Act number 102 of 1993 as a replacement of the sales tax. This is a tax payable on the supply of goods and services at different stages of product supply and service delivery value chain. The burden of the tax ultimately falls on the final consumer. Now, while there are currently legal challenges to Nigeria's way of collecting VAT, there is a modification for the country's standing VAT order. The order modifies and expands the list of exempted goods and services in the VAT Act and provides clarification on the exempted items already listed in the Act. Nigeria's Minister of Finance is empowered by Section 38 of the Act to amend, vary, or modify the list set out in the Act. In October of 2020, there was a modification that defined certain items contained in the list of exempted items and further expanded the list. This new VAT Modification Order 2021 now revokes and supersedes that of 2020 and all other modification orders issued before the commencement of the latest one. What is now on the expanded list? How will this benefit Nigerians, if there is any benefit? We'll get into the details today as we look at Nigeria modifying its VAT order. I'm Tolulope Adeleru-Balogun. Welcome. This is Business Edge. Now joining me is Emeka Chime. He's an Associate Director of PricewaterhouseCoopers, and we're going to be getting into this conversation together. Emeka, welcome to Business Edge. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much. It's my pleasure.
So let's start with a bit of background on the VAT conversation in Nigeria. So there's been a lot of conversation surrounding the collection of VAT in Nigeria. So the 2022 fiscal policy sets out a plan to implement an aggressive VAT revenue drive, which is expected to yield about 316 billion naira next year. So let's start with that. How has Nigeria been doing with the VAT collection and compliance so far?
Yes, like you rightly said, VAT is one of the highest revenue earners in terms of tax for the government. In fact, last year, VAT was the highest single tax head, even surpassing, petroleum profits tax, which used to be the highest, and companies income tax, among others. So Nigeria, together with other countries, has been focusing on indirect taxes, particularly VAT, as a means to generate revenue. Considering that it is borne by the final consumer, what the government has tried to do is to kind of streamline the kind of goods and services that will be subject to VAT to kind of protect vulnerable Nigerians. And that's why the VAT modification order and the recent amendment of the Finance Act have tried to clarify the items that are exempt or attract VAT at a zero rate.
Okay, so we know that the VAT Act has been amended many times. This is something that's been in play in Nigeria for almost 3 decades now. And there have been some key changes, such as the definition of exempt items, then the exemption threshold for small businesses, requirement for foreign suppliers to also charge VAT, self-charging of VAT, and so on and so forth. For the 2020 order modification or modification order, what was changed in 2020 before we get into this latest one?
Thank you so much. So in 2020, the modification order tried to bring Nigeria's VAT system up to tune with current realities. So in the 2020 order, there were clear definitions for certain items that were not clearly defined in previous versions of Nigeria's VAT law. So we had definitions, for example, for things like plants and equipment used in gas utilization. We also had definitions and inclusion in exempt items for things like renewable energy equipment. The 2020 order also tried to clarify that rent could be VAT exempt if it is residential rent and so on and so forth. So the 2020 order actually provided some clarity, but the 2021 order can be seen as a step forward because it did provide more clarity for certain items, although there are things that it kind of reversed. And I'm sure when we get to the 2021 order discussion, I will talk more on that.
So let's go straight into that. So with this recent modification order, what changes now concerning Nigeria's VAT system?
Thank you. So I would say that the recent modification order, first of all, has streamlined the VAT system for gas. Now, the previous modification order exempted all kinds of gas from VAT. So exempted natural gas, it exempted LPG, and different kinds of gas. But this recent modification order has said that the only gas that will be exempt from VAT is gas that is supplied to electricity generating companies or locally produced LPG. So those are the only kinds of gas that are now exempt from VAT. Some other petroleum products remain exempt, kerosene, aviation turbine kerosene, and crude. But from a gas perspective, we no longer have that wide exemption that the previous order provided. Another thing that this new modification order has done is to say that exports of non-oil products are no longer zero rated. They are not exempt. Now, while this might seem like good news, digging deep, it might actually have negative implications, because moving something from being zero rated to being exempt means that the input VAT that the exporter incurred in purchasing those items will no longer be claimable. If I just give a brief background, the way Nigeria's VAT system works for goods is that somebody can claim input VAT if what they sell is also VATable. It can be VATable on the standard rate, which is 7.5%, or can be VATable on the zero rate. Now, to say that the sales will no longer be VATable, which is that they will be exempt, automatically therefore restricts the claim of input VAT. So therefore, exporters and other people that now will be selling things that are now VAT exempt no longer have any opportunity to recover VAT that they may have incurred in purchasing those items.
Okay, so I want us to go to the LPG conversation, and then I'll ask about what could be behind some of these changes. So as you said, it's now exemptions only for locally produced LPG from VAT, and then basically meaning any imported LPG will be taxed. And also we've seen that gas used for making fertilizers, private power generation, as you mentioned, will also be there. But now we've seen the price of gas skyrocket in the past few months for Nigerians. And you would have to ask that going into the end of the year, going into another year, what's behind this decision to only have locally produced LPG be exempted, especially at a time when we know that household incomes have not moved, but inflation has risen, the cost of food has risen, transportation has risen. So when we look at this, how do you think this particular exemption around the LPG situation will affect Nigerians?
Absolutely. And that's why one of the calls of the public is for gas in its totality to be totally exempt, or better off, even zero rated. Because the recent move of only exempting locally produced LPG, while being from a very good intention, does not reflect current realities. Because the capacity of Nigeria to produce all the LPG needed for local consumption is not yet in full scale. So in reality, we import all the LPG. And since, like I mentioned, in 2020, all kinds of gas were listed as exempt, there was actually a pushback by the FIRS and also a pushback in practice on imports, and that contributed recently to the increase in the price of LPG, because even though the old VAT modification order exempted all kinds of gas from VAT, what we saw recently was that on importation of LPG, VAT was assessed and imposed, and that contributed to the high price of LPG in the market. So the idea behind exempting locally produced LPG while being from a right standpoint, like I mentioned, might not reflect current realities because we actually need to import LPG to meet some of our gas needs as a country. So this boils down not just LPG, but also, when we have conversations around natural gas. I mean, Nigeria being a country with, one of the largest natural gas reserves in the world, it's only, I think it should be common sense to incentivize local players by providing a favorable VAT regime so that, this gas can be exploited. And, we can even hopefully reduce gas flaring, as is the practice in many parts of the southern part of the country.
All right, so before we go for a quick break, so we've mentioned a few things. We've seen an aggressive drive by the federal government to increase, of course, tax revenue, tax generation. And you've said before that VAT is now at the top of the list. It tops the list in terms of taxes for bringing in money. But also when you now look at a move like only having locally produced LPG being exempted and the knockdown effect on Nigerians, you have to have a conversation as to the drive for the revenue generation and then the actual effects, the reality of it. So when we have these conversations around this, what's behind removing some of these items from the exemption list? Is it simply, do you think, in terms of about generating more revenue for the country? Because again, as we said, if you now look at the knockdown effect of the prices going up, the attendant consequences on Nigerian households where people spend already more than 50% of their income on food-related items, it's going to be harder for Nigerians.
Absolutely, absolutely. And from where we sit, we know that what the tax authorities are looking at solely is revenue at point in time. And that's why we are, advocating for that wider look to consider the impact on ordinary Nigerians that rely on these items. But for now, it looks like the motive for restricting the exemption to only locally produced gas, even though, the majority of gas consumed in Nigeria is imported, is strictly from a revenue perspective. So that's correct.
All right. So, Emeka, hold the line. We're going to have a conversation about this a bit more because there are those who believe that VAT is a regressive tax and really not in the best interest of the general public. There are arguments for that and the fact that it affects every level of society, including the poorest individuals in society. And when we come back, we'll get further into this conversation as to whether or not Nigerians will benefit from this latest VAT modification. You're watching Business Edge. Do stay with us. My guest is Emeka Chime, Associate Director with PricewaterhouseCoopers. Now, we're going to look at issues around some of these major changes. So we have renewable energy equipment, petroleum products, although this is also restricted, not all. On the list is also raw materials for production of baby diapers and sanitary towels, locally produced animal feeds, agricultural seeds, and seedlings. So, Emeka, while we talked about the fact that the VAT situation around gas, LPG, could be revenue driven, what do you think is the conversation happening behind the scenes as regards to some of these other items?
Yes. So, and just to pick up on one of your earlier comments around how VAT can be regressive. Now, that's
totally... I want you to wait. We're going to wrap with that. Don't worry, we're getting to that.
Okay. And thank you. I was trying to tie it into this point.
Okay.
But the other changes, so it's not all doom and gloom, really, because while there are things that we feel that the government can do better, there are a lot of other things that some thought has been put into to try to protect vulnerable Nigerians. I mean, you already mentioned renewable energy equipment. We've seen the current move to move towards a greener environment, and therefore, investors in that space now have that incentive as their products also become cheaper to consumers. One thing also is that VAT has been excluded on electricity, electricity supplied by discos to ordinary Nigerians. So there should be an expectation for the price of electricity to also go down. So that's also a positive when we look at what the government has done to rationalize some of the items from a VAT perspective. In addition, the VAT Act had exemptions for services provided by People's Bank.
Yes.
But in realities, I mean, it wasn't clear what people's banks were. But the VAT modification order has gone ahead to replace that, with, microfinance banks, which is what we're more commonly aware of, to say tier 1 and tier 2 unit microfinance banks, when they provide their services, they're exempt. The VAT Act also exempts, or rather the VAT modification order also exempts, shared transportation services, tickets sold by commercial airlines, although they try to qualify it to say that, where it is in the form of ride hailing, or if it is, hired for private use, the VAT exemption will not apply.
Okay.
And to be honest, from my perspective, I think, without mentioning any names, but considering how increasingly popular some of these ride-hailing services are becoming, it might not be very accurate to say that, it's not used by ordinary Nigerians, right? So maybe ordinary Nigerians maybe, the VAT exemption might also have been directed in that line also. But generally, yes, so these items are exempt, and that should, portend, positive outcomes for ordinary Nigerians.
I want to go back to this shared road transport and the leased. So what is excluded in the order is leased, hired, or rented motor vehicles or transportation apparatus for business or private use, or a car or ride hailing. And we know that there's been a lot of conversation around this, particularly in a city like Lagos, with some of the moves we've seen in the recent 2 to 3 years past. Do you think this is a signal to that industry, which is an industry that's still trying to grow, even though now there are also Nigerian ride hailing companies as well? What kind of signal do you think it might send to that burgeoning industry here in Nigeria?
Yeah, well, to be honest, the tax authorities have been keen on that industry, and not just that industry, other industries or other services provided digitally. So not just Nigeria, there's been a worldwide move to correctly assess tax on services provided digitally. So it's been the historical perspective that foreign companies are only taxed in Nigeria where they have boots on the ground, physical presence. But now we see that companies can be everywhere and make money from Nigeria from a digitally, and those services have escaped tax. And so tax authorities worldwide are waking up to how to tax the digital economy. So there have been those questions already in that industry, and the questions around tax are not new. The practical issue had always been that, some of the players in those industries are ordinary people like you and me.
Yeah.
And, it's been difficult to collect VAT from such, individuals as against, businesses and companies that the FIRS or the tax authorities can identify. So yes, tax authorities are keen on that industry. And the VAT modification order 2020 included a blanket exemption for shared transportation services. But now I think they've looked at it and said, we will only exempt shared transportation services except, this industry that we know we're talking about, right?
Yeah.
The ride hailing and the ones hired for private use, because of their historical focus on that industry and trying to tax the digital economy in general.
So we've seen that line drawn in the sand. It'll be interesting to see how long the line stays in the sand. So overall,
Right.
with this modification, the VAT order modification for 2021, do you think it's overall a positive for the average Nigerian, or for the majority of Nigerians? Let me put it like that.
Yeah, well, for the majority of Nigerians, yes. The changes with respect to electricity, the clarity that, petroleum products like kerosene and the rest, which are used by, ordinary Nigerians, that the clarity that they are exempt is a positive also. Commercial airlines, tickets, the clarity that that is also exempt, even though that was included in the law, but the that it's also exempt is something good for Nigerians. to be honest, more can be done in the area of LPG to expand that incentive really to cover all kinds of LPG. And I dare say natural gas also to develop our gas sector. I think that what we can also look at in terms of policy is the FIRS strengthening its refund system. Because the way VAT works really is that when you sell something that is zero rated, you should be able to claim a refund for your input VAT. But in practice, that's never happened. And so if the tax authorities or the government in general can look at, the exports, instead of making them exempt, reversing them to zero rated, and then trying to strengthen the refund mechanism, I think those will contribute to making, this new focus on VAT beneficial to ordinary Nigerians.
All right, so now let's get to that regressive question, because it's a really big debate. I see you're ready for it. And so there's theory and evidence that suggests that VAT is passed along to consumers at the end of the day via higher prices. Those who advocate for VAT claim that they raise government revenues without punishing the wealthy by charging them more through a possible income tax. Then critics also say that VAT therefore places an undue economic burden on lower income taxpayers. Those who make the least amount of money, they're still paying the same amount of VAT as somebody who can afford to pay much more. Where do you stand in this argument, especially when you look at the economic fortunes of Nigeria, a country that unfortunately has the highest poverty rates in the world, or one of the highest poverty rates in the world? Unemployment stands in double digits, around 20-something%, high food inflation, high cost of transportation. Households spend more than half of their income on food. Where does this place us in this kind of conversation?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head when you mentioned, that households spend a high proportion of their income on food and consumption in general. So when you have a poor economy, or when you have a low income economy, let me put it that way, VAT will be regressive, because VAT is a consumption tax, right? And if for poor income earners, you spend majority of your income on consumption, it therefore means that you bear a high burden from a VAT perspective compared to high income earners that have surplus for investments and savings and only spend a low proportion of their income on consumption. So in that sense, yes, VAT is regressive. So from a policy perspective, the whole move to exempt things that are very consumption related, so basic food items, rent, and the rest, is driven towards ameliorating this regressive nature of VAT. But I think that until we get to a situation where we even have a proper VAT system, then it would even remain the way it is, or might even get worse.
Okay.
And what do I mean by a proper VAT system?
Very quickly, one last sentence on this, Emeka.
Okay. So Nigeria currently operates a pass-through VAT system only for goods. So things like services, where the supplier incurs VAT, they can't reclaim it back and assets. Meanwhile, in other countries, you can do that. So until we have this framework that allows all services, all goods, fixed assets for the VAT incurred to be able to be reclaimed, they will continue to be piled up as additional costs when sold to the final consumer. So until we reconfigure our system, that problem might still be there.
And of course, the current legal challenges are going to add a different layer to the conversation as well. Emeka Chime, thank you so much for joining me. We'll be talking about this conversation. There's a drive, not just here in Nigeria, but across the continent for more tax revenue, and it will hit the people at the poorest end of the structure even more. And we have to see how we can fix that. Thank you so much for joining me on Business Edge.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
All right. And it's a conversation, as we told you, that continues. There are states in court right now in Nigeria suing the federal government over the collection of VAT. And that's a different conversation, a different layer to the conversation around taxation here in the country. But what we have for you, a second layer to Business Edge, is NC4 to watch. That comes up right now. And as we wrap up, we have a few stories we're keeping our eyes on. We start in the eastern parts of the continent, where the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation has delayed the disbursement of a 53.97 billion Kenyan shillings loan to finance the entry of a Safaricom-led consortium into the Ethiopian telecoms market. Now, it cited uncertainty over the ongoing unrest in Ethiopia's Tigray region. President Cyril Ramaphosa announced that South Africa has concluded a historic agreement to secure 131 billion rand to finance the country's transition to a low-carbon economy. Partner countries include the UK, US, France, Germany, and EU, and they will mobilize $8.5 billion over the next 3 to 5 years through a range of financial instruments, grants, and concessional financing as well. And third on the list, Nigeria, which is Africa's largest crude oil producer, has joined some of the world's largest energy exporters like Saudi Arabia and Russia to pledge to eliminate planet's warming emissions by 2060. President Buhari vowed to unconditionally cut emissions by 20% below the business-as-usual levels by 2030. The reductions can be increased to 47% if the country gets financial assistance, technology transfer, and capacity building from the more advanced and willing international partners. And finally, Ghana wants to boost domestic revenue with a digitized tax system that improves compliance, according to the vice president. Ghana's revenue fell short of its target by 12% in the first 7 months of the year, raising concerns about the country's ability to finance its debts. And that's the show today. As always, thank you for watching. Follow us on social media at News Central TV. And of course, download our mobile app and subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'll be back your way 11 a.m. West African time as we talk the biggest business, economic, and financial stories coming out of the continent. I'm Tolulope Adeleru-Balogun. Have a good day.